Welcome back to part 6 of A Beautiful Game, the Karma rendering series, and in this part we're going over render settings. Now, in previous parts we have worked with some render settings, but that was with the Karma ROP output node. Now, that node is very similar to the one used in Solaris. In fact, they're almost identical. However, in this part I'm going to go further into some of the render settings that are useful to know, and kind of just give you an idea of where you really need to focus your attention when working with the Karma render node. I'm going to be giving some interesting information as to how the node works, how you can utilize it depending on the project, and also how to get the most out of your renders. So I'll briefly touch on render parameters and how you can use those. So let's go ahead and open up part 6's file. You will find p6_render_settings.hip. We can go ahead and open that file up. So in this file, we have exactly what we left off with in the previous part. And so to continue on from here, we're going to be adding a render node. So you can go ahead and just tab in a Karma render node. Now, this node over here, you can see that when we set our display flag over here or have it selected, that over on the scene graph paths, you now have this render path. Now, this over here contains render settings. And this is kind of interesting because it works like your cameras and your lights, where you have cameras and a main camera, lights, and the various lights. What you have with this render primitive is a bunch of settings for different types of renders. Now, if we take a look at this node, over here we have the render settings primitive path, and it automatically generates this /render/render settings. Now, in this case, this is the only render settings we have, but you can do something kind of interesting. You can drop down a Karma render properties right over here. And what you can do is you can have separate render settings. You'll notice that this node is exactly like this Karma render node, except you can't render from here, right? It has none of the render to disk or render to mplay functionality. However, you can set up render parameters. And this is pretty interesting because, for example, what you could have is you could have one like this. And over here, I'm just going to change the primitives path to preview. So say you do a 1280 by 720, and then you do another Karma render properties right over here. And then this one might be your final quality. And perhaps this one is HD, right? So now we have these two. And if we expand our render primitive, we have preview over there. If we select over here, we have final and preview. And you can easily switch between these. For example, if you go in here to your render settings, you can choose between preview, final, and render settings, right? So if we choose preview, it'll render in our viewport with the preview settings. If we choose final, our final settings, and so on. And so I'm not going to go too much into all of that right now, but I just thought I would show you that because it is quite interesting to have these render properties like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove those two and just focus on this render node. Okay, so before I get into any secondary settings, I want to reiterate on what's important here. So let's first look at the camera. By default, it chooses camera 1. We're going to need to change that to our main camera. We've renamed our camera, so we need to rename the camera that is being brought in. Now, as for an output picture, this is what you would usually do. You might do something like chessboard render.$f. So that would just be the frame number, .exr, right? So that would be an EXR sequence, and then you could render the current frame or the frame range. Then we have resolution. So resolution, you can change this to whatever resolution you'd like. For this, I'll set it to HD. Then we have these settings that hopefully we're familiar with from the previous part. We have pixel samples, min ray, max ray. So I'm going to set the pixel samples to 64 and the min ray to something like 4. Now that should give us a decent looking render. Once again, remember we can go to our advanced settings, and over here we have our noise level, which we're not going to necessarily need at this point. We also have our driver if we'd like to change this to bucket. So in this case, I am going to set it to bucket, not a big deal. So if we take a look at our render, we kind of have what we'd expect to have, right? We just have this scene being rendered out and this resolution. And if we were to render to mplay, we'd have a decent quality render. Right? But sometimes there are some extra settings that are useful to know. So the first one that I'm going to explore is under camera effect. By default, depth of field is active and motion blur is active. In our scene, we don't have any motion, so we won't focus on motion blur in this part. We will focus on it in the next part though. So depth of field. This is enabled by default, but clearly we can see we don't have any depth of field. And the reason is because on the actual camera itself, you need to set up your depth of field. Depth of field is fairly nuanced. It's not as simple as if things are further away, it's blurry. It's also scale dependent. Now, something that I've noticed with Karma and the Solaris workflow is something that I'm not entirely sure of why it exists, but it does. And it's something that I think that you should be aware of. So I'm going to go over to this main camera and I'm going to show you the problem first and then explain what the solution is. So if you are familiar with working with depth of field and anything like that, you know that focus distance defines where your focal plane is, while f-stop defines how much blurring is created by your depth of field. And I'm actually just going to disable the bucket render just so that our viewport can render progressively. Okay, so with our main camera, right, if we change our f-stop to something that's expected, so let's say 3.2, you would expect to see some depth of field, right, some blurring, especially at the scale. And let's say we switch our focus distance to something lower, like 0.5, right? We would definitely be expecting to see some sort of blurring. However, if we go over to our view and we look at our focal length and our horizontal aperture, you'll notice that these values are odd. If you're familiar with any sort of camera settings, focal length is never this value. It will never be 0.05. So what I'm going to do is set it to something that's more common. You can do like a 35 mil or a 50 mil. I'm going to do a 50 with a horizontal aperture of 50. Right? That puts us in pretty much the same situation, but now you'll notice that we have that blurring. So if we do a 50 focal length with 50 horizontal aperture and an f-stop of 3.2 with a focus distance of 0.5, we have some depth of field. Of course, an f-stop of 3.2 we can increase or decrease depending on whether we want less or more blurring, respectively. And then focus distance, obviously, that's where your focal point is. Now, something that's pretty awesome about Karma is that it has a lot of functionality in the viewport for adjusting settings. One of those is the focus plane. Now, focus distance can be a bit of a pain when trying to get it looking right. However, you can press Shift and F, and this will bring up this plane, right? You can see that it's intersecting these pieces. If we press Shift plus F again, it will make it opaque so that we can see exactly where that plane is. And then if we Shift plus click, it will move our focal plane to that position. So as you can see, it adjusted our focus distance over here, and we could click all the way back at the board and over there, and it will push it further back, or right up front over here on this piece, and this will be in focus. And this is pretty awesome. So once again, if you press Shift F, it will toggle the viewing of your focal plane. We can go again, Shift F to gain this outline. And again, I'm just going to Shift plus click to shift my focal distance. Now, all of this is keyframeable, and you can still make changes in the actual node. So cool, we've got our depth of field working. So remember to keep that in mind. Under your view, you may need to adjust your focal length and horizontal aperture depending on the scaling of your scene. 50 and 50 are decent defaults, same thing with about 35. As for focus distance, that's just where your focus is, and f-stop defines how much blurring occurs. So I'm actually going to increase this a bit. I think 5.2 might be better. Yeah, so there's slightly less blurring on these pieces up front, but still a decent amount. Okay, so let's go back to our settings. Right, I'm going to go under sampling, and I'm just going to talk through a couple of things. As you can see, we have this convergence mode variant. Now, convergence mode is a pretty tricky concept that I haven't entirely wrapped my head around myself. Basically, for anyone who is interested in kind of rendering and things, you can search Monte Carlo convergence rendering, and you'll find information about this. Now, with Monte Carlo rendering, there's different ways in which renders are run. So we have 3 different modes, right? So we have variance. And variance gives you access to min ray and max ray. Basically, it tries to figure out how many rays should I use on this area to achieve an acceptable noise level, where our noise level is decided by this under the advanced sampling, that noise level over there. However, we also have access to path traced. Path trace doesn't give you access to that variance. As you can see, we lose some settings and it only uses pixel samples. So what it does is it shoots out rays, and each one of those rays definitely bounces. So the downside to this is that if you have a scene with a lot of bounce light, it will take a lot longer with path traced. However, there are situations where path traced is useful. For example, the other day I was rendering a ship, and the ship was outdoors and at quite a distance. On the ship, there were ropes, right? There were ropes connecting the different sails, and I had an issue where there was too much noise occurring in those ropes. And it was because the ropes were so thin. And initially I was using variance. But the issue with variance was that I had to push up my pixel samples extremely high to get it clean. And so what ended up happening was I just wasted a lot of samples in areas that didn't need it. However, with path traced, because it was outdoors, I didn't have many bounces. So path tracing really helped clean up those ropes. And I dropped my render time from about 4 minutes to just over 1 minute, which is pretty insane. And the quality was actually better with path traced. So there are situations where you might want to use path traced. However, sometimes you know exactly where your trouble areas are. And that's where distributed is quite useful. So with distributed, you can choose what BSDF component gets what amount of samples. For example, say you have a scene like we have here, where our transmissive materials and our subsurface materials may have more noise. What you can do is you can independently push up, for example, your refraction samples and your subsurface. So something like that, right? Where you're pushing up just for refraction and just for subsurface scattering. And that can help clean up those problem areas when you know where the problem areas are. So I'm going to set this back to variance, and we can now move on to some other settings. Very briefly, under light's quality, the light sampling mode as light tree is generally good. You don't really need to change this. However, keep in mind that light tree is most beneficial when you have a lot of lights in your scene. When there's fewer lights, you might want to use uniform. So that's just something to keep in mind. However, this is generally not going to be changed, at least in my own experience. Under limits, we have some interesting controls. Limits basically control how many light bounces are allowed before we stop letting that light bounce. So in the situation of refraction, that is our transmissive material. We're letting it have 4 bounces and then we say no more. What that means is that if you have 4 pieces of glass kind of in a row, it will only be able to make it through those 4. If you add a 5th piece of glass, it won't reach that 5th piece. And that's interesting because oftentimes you may end up with black artifacts inside of a refractive surface or refractive material, or in a scene with a lot of transmissive materials. If that's the case, you may want to increase your refraction limit, in the same way that if you don't have a lot of transmissive materials, you may want to drop this. So I'm going to just quickly show you. If we just switch to our Karma viewport, and we go over here to our refraction limit, if we drop this to 0, so we're saying no refraction at all, you can see that all of our transmissive materials become black, right? There's no light being allowed to bounce inside of them. Now you may see that and think that volume limit and subsurface scattering limit being 0 is a bad thing, but they actually do allow light to bounce inside, and any value higher than 0 and 0 on these will allow more light inside. So the refraction limit over here, as you can see, if we set it up to 1, all of these will be a little bit dark. If we set it up to 2, we're starting to get what we're going for, and sometimes it's best just to be safe to add an extra layer, just in case we're in a camera angle where we're seeing a piece of glass through another piece of glass. We don't want there to be any issues. So again, we can just set this back up to something like 3. Now, in this case, we haven't changed it very much, but in a scene where you have a lot of glass, you may need to increase this or decrease this. And this can save you a lot of render time or protect you from those artifacts that you end up with in your transmissive materials. The next thing is this color limit over here. Now, color limit basically just kills all of the light. And what it helps with is extremely bright areas. You can remove fireflies by reducing your color limit, but the downside is that it darkens your scene. And you can see this if I drop it really low. So if we take a look over here, we have these bright areas. And perhaps this is a good time to also use snapshot, right? So I can bring up a snapshot over here, and my other ones still exist. I can just quickly take a snap over here, and then we can drop our color limit just to 1, and then take another snap. So as you can see here, we have our 2 renders. This is the one with the color limit set to 1, and this is with it set to 10. As you can see, there's a lot of dark areas. We lose a lot of vibrance in our shot. So that's something to just be careful of, but it can save you from fireflies. So keep that in mind if you need to deal with fireflies. Okay, Russian roulette cutoff. Not really anything you really need to focus on. Basically, it's a smart way that the renderer figures out where light bounces should be and where they shouldn't be, and when to kill the light bounces. It'll look at, say, diffuse materials and be like, okay, diffuse materials don't really bounce much light, so let's kill those bounces. However, let's say on a reflective surface, we need those bounces to stay alive. So Russian roulette will figure that out for you. Generally not an option you'll play around with much. I think that covers pretty much everything about render quality, right? You have your sampling, you have your limits, and these are mainly the areas that you'll focus on. The one other thing that I want to show you is some more advanced XPU stuff. So I'm just going to minimize this, bring up my scene graph, switch this to XPU, and let's just give this an XPU render and see what happens. So as you can see, we end up with a bunch of these unsupported types, right? A bunch of these issues. And as far as I know, these are from subsurf. So a lot of the subsurface things over here are now just treated as diffuse, right? You can see over there, we no longer have subsurf. This renders really quickly. However, we also have this issue right at the top, light incompatible with XPU due to having complex shaping or shading, skipped spotlight. Now, that's because our spotlight is an IES light. If it weren't an IES light, it would still work. So we can disable this just for now. And the other reason that our scene is so dark now is because the dome light doesn't allow exposure to have any sort of influence on the scene. So if we set this to like 10, literally no different. That doesn't mean that the HDRI is not working, it just means that it doesn't use exposure. It does, however, use intensity. If we set this up to something like 4, you can see that we still have our HDRI contributing to the scene. So over here, you can see that we're ending up with a decent looking render. We of course just don't have our subsurface, but we are using XPU, so it's pretty cool, right? This is an option. If your scene allows, you can go ahead and use XPU. So quickly changing back to the CPU engine. There's one last thing that I'd like to just go over. Just going to reset my intensity back to 1. And the last thing that I'd like to cover has to do with denoising. So when you're rendering with Karma, you do have access under the image output filters to the denoiser. You have access to the NVIDIA optics denoiser and the Intel denoiser. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a tip. When using a denoiser, if you're using a low resolution, so I would say low resolution is anything at HD or lower, and then you use a denoiser, what the denoiser might do is kind of soften your small details. It might see it as noise and then soften. So I have an example of it. On the screen now, you should see a playback of what it looks like when you have a fairly noisy render that gets denoised. And so I can show you kind of how you get those settings. I'm going to drop this to about 16 pixel samples, so not a very high quality render. I will reset everything and just put this back up to 9. So this shouldn't be a very clean render, but I do have NVIDIA Optics Denoiser enabled, and if I say render to mplay, we should see that as these tiles render, they get cleaned up by the Optics Denoiser. Right, so this might look very clean, right? It looks pretty good, but if we take a look back here, you end up with this blotchiness, right? There's these areas where there's distortion, and that's because it's trying its best to clean up that noise. As a result, what it's doing is it's seeing actual details as noise. And so you end up with a clean scene, and maybe for a still, this is okay. But when you're playing this back and your noise pattern is changing, well, that's when you have some issues. So this is a low quality render, right? We're taking, say, 50 seconds, maybe a minute to render this. Now, if I go back over here and I change some settings, so I'm going to change my resolution. I'm going to push my resolution up to 4K. So I'm doubling both of these fields, and then I'm dropping my pixel samples. So I'm going to drop this just to like 4, right? Super low. And then I'm going to render to mplay with denoising. This is something that's kind of interesting, and it's something that I'd like you to keep in mind because it might become useful to you in the future. So as you can see, we're now rendering at 4K at a much lower pixel sample. And this may take somewhat longer, but the interesting thing about this is now that because we're working at a higher resolution, it doesn't mistake details for noise. So you don't end up with such large distortion, you end up with much smaller distortion. And then if you downscale this to a 1080 render, then you end up with something decent. So what you can do is actually render higher resolution at a lower sample count with denoising and get a better result than if you were to render a high quality, low resolution render. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's just a technique that I sometimes use, especially when working under tight deadlines. You can often get away with denoising a large image and then downscaling it. So that's just something that I thought I would show you. And of course, that isn't a hard and fast rule. Generally, you should be rendering at the resolution that you want with the correct settings. So something like this would be good, and then you can still go ahead and use the denoiser. So I hope that this helped you. I tried to get through as many of the relevant settings as possible without going into things like AOVs and deep output. In future parts, I'll be getting into that. So please check those out if you're interested in rendering out AOVs, things like Z-depth, cryptomat, things like deep EXR is another thing that we're going to be covering. We're going to be covering volumes and volume motion blur. So check all of that out. Again, thank you for watching. I hope that this was helpful. I will see you in the next part, which will be part 7. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.